And with this, the process started all over again. It makes sense to picture the invention of language in the same way. Language was first crafted to fit the minds of our ancestors, and over time, the reliance on it started to enhance and expand what those minds could do. This led to further refinements in the technology of language, and then the process started anew. This is an evolutionary story, but it works over development too. Human babies enter the world with a brain that receives language like a hand that grips the perfectly shaped object. It's just the right fit. And once a child starts to use language, it ratchets up what the mind can do, and this propels development and learning. This in turn allows the mind to handle increasingly sophisticated language, and with that, the cycle starts right back up again. It's in this framework that we'll explore two ways that language can shape who we are. One way considers how having any language molds various aspects of the mind, like emotion, personality, and thought. You can think of this as the effects of capital L language. A second way considers how having a particular language, like English or Hebrew or Navajo, how do these particular linguistic variations influence minds specifically? You can think of this as the effects of small L language. It turns out that this second specific effect of language is much more controversial than the first, so that's where we'll start. And then in a couple lectures, we'll move on to the big L effects of language. But before we begin, let me preface this discussion with a warning. Unlike much of what we covered earlier in the course, what I'm about to discuss is far from settled. Don't get me wrong, there's still opposition to a few of the big ideas from early on, like the claim that language is unique to humans or that it's a new machine built out of old parts. But the resistance to these things comes from an ever-dwindling scientific minority. Things are different with what I'm about to present. It's a real mess. And rather than paint you a pretty picture, I'll intentionally emphasize the tangled and thorny nature of the debate. Looking behind us, science often appears as a clear and well-worn trail. But things are different when you're at the front, hacking away at the jungle, trying to find the path forward. So grab a machete and let's get to work. Having signed up for this course, you've probably heard the old chestnut about Eskimos having dozens of unique words for snow. And it's true. Eskimo Aleut languages have many words that describe snowy things. This diverse vocabulary was first formally discussed by the eminent anthropologist Franz Boas in his 1911 work, The Handbook of American Indian Languages. So take Inuit, for example. Inuit has a few different word stems for snow, in addition to many morphemes that can add nuance to the central meaning, like suffixes for falling and blowing, or freezing and melting. Nothing about this is currently debatable. You've already learned that even though many languages like English generate most of their grammatical complexity through syntax, other languages like Inuit put more complexity into their morphology. What made this observation controversial was a much later claim made by the budding linguist Benjamin Lee Whorf. In 1940, Whorf published a short paper called Science and Linguistics, where he took Boas's observation a few steps further. He argued that possessing so many unique words for snow, words for snow falling, snow blowing, snow on the ground, slushy snow, hard snow, and so on, Whorf argued that these specific names actually caused Eskimos to experience the world differently than people whose language has only a few names for snow. Eventually, these ideas congealed into what is now referred to as the Whorfian hypothesis, or sometimes the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, because of the contribution of Whorf's teacher, the linguist Edward Sapir, who, by the way, was trained by Franz Boas. Here's a famous quote from Whorf that nicely captures the position. "We dissect nature along lines laid down by our native languages. The categories and types that we isolate from the world of phenomena, we do not find there because they stare every observer in the face. On the contrary, the world is presented in a kaleidoscopic flux of impressions which has to be organized by our minds. and this means largely by the linguistic systems in our minds. As you can tell, Whorf had a way with words, which was a big reason why his ideas made such a splash with the public. The hypothesis sprouted two versions, one strong and one weak. The strong version is called linguistic determinism, and the idea is that language enables or dictates thought. As you might imagine, this view can lead to some pretty radical interpretations, like if your language doesn't have an expression for it, you can't experience it. This strong hypothesis is sometimes treated as the only game in town, and it's become quite a sport to tear it down. Steven Pinker had an absolute field day with linguistic determinism in his book, The Language Instinct. There's no question, if you take it to its logical extreme, you end up into some pretty absurd places. For example, it would mean that babies don't think at all until they learn language. Or it entails that aphasics who lose all ability to use language also lose all ability to think. And most ridiculous of all, it leads to the conclusion that because only humans have language, we are the only species capable of thought. Unfortunately, this extreme version distracts from the much more plausible version of the hypothesis, which is called linguistic relativity. This toned-down version claims that differences across languages simply influence differences in thinking. Don't get me wrong, this is still hotly debated, but the debate is more about the nature and extent of this influence and less about it being logically nonsensical. Before we jump into the fray, I'd like to offer a helpful framing, one that's often absent from the debate that bolsters the logic of linguistic relativity. Traditionally, linguists, anthropologists, and cognitive scientists have focused mostly on cross-cultural comparisons of adult cognition and language. Largely missing from these inquiries is any significant attention to the underlying neural and developmental mechanisms that shape this adult product. Think back to our three basic principles about the brain: neural specialization, neural connectability, and neuroplasticity. We know that massive exposure, massive input from the environment causes the brain to undergo extensive plasticity to modify and even create specialized neural networks over development. We've discussed this at length, both within the domain of language and also outside of it, when we talked about face perception. This is basic fact. It's neuroscience 101. So from this perspective, it's completely reasonable to hypothesize that learning different languages might be a mechanism for the brain to think, feel, and experience different things. In other words, if acquiring a particular language makes the brain more specialized for that language, which we know to be true, why can't that acquisition also make the brain more specialized for other things, like memory, perception, categories of emotion, social judgments, you name it? Consider our snow example. By having so many unique words for snow, it's possible that the habitual use of those distinct words induces neuroplasticity, causing Eskimos to become particularly good at perceptually differentiating among the various categories of snow. Of course, you can still do this even if your language doesn't habitually make this distinction, but it could be much harder. Does this sound familiar? This is reminiscent of Patricia Kuhl's perceptual magnet effect. Recall that Japanese speakers don't have phonetic categories for ra and la. Instead, they have a single category that subsumes them both. So whenever a monolingual Japanese speaker hears the two sounds, they perceive them as one thing. The mechanism is that the brain neurally commits to one phonetic category instead of two like we do in English. It's a similar idea with linguistic relativity, but instead of a perceptual magnet, you can think of it more like a conceptual magnet. Habitual distinctions in a language highlight distinct concepts, but habitual non-distinctions in a different language highlight a single concept, and these conceptual variations may guide people to perceive different things in the world. Okay, that's the basic logic. So with that in mind, we're ready to enter the debate. Let's begin with the Eskimo snow example, because that's the controversial meme that started it all. One of the most well-known and most lively critiques was from the British-American linguist Geoffrey Pullum. Pullum made his argument first in a witty little essay, and then later, in 1991, he turned it into a book. The title was not subtle. It was called The Great Eskimo Vocabulary Hoax. One of Pullum's main arguments was that, in terms of semantics, there's nothing special about how Eskimos refer to snow. Sure, they may have dedicated words to describe various snowy things, but other languages can do the same, just in different ways. For example, unlike Inuit, English does not have a single word for snow drifting along the ground. But English can still easily express that concept. You want proof? Well, I just did it. Snow drifting along the ground is 5 words instead of 1, but it works just fine. We also have other options in English. We can create compounds like snowflake, or we can use related words like frost and slush, or we can put an adjective in front of a noun, making things like ice storm, hardpack, and whiteout conditions. So the gist of Pullum's argument is that there's more than one way languages can get the job done. But here's a reasonable counter-argument. Might there be something special about having a single dedicated word for a concept versus having many optional ways to express it? So when snow is blowing sideways, there's no choice in Inuit to simply use a generic word for snow. Using the precise one is obligatory. In English, we have the freedom to say what we want about this snowy scene. We can say snow or snow blowing sideways, you name it. If you think about how habit and plasticity are related, this distinction between vocabulary that